In this video lecture, we're going to take a look at section summaries of the major chapters of The Island of Dr. Moreau that you were assigned to read for this week. As we go along, I'm going to parse out certain details of the earlier chapters and analyze key quotations to explain to you or to elaborate on some of the central themes that this text is developing. I'll also tie these themes into the larger exploration of the medical community and the worldview that underlies both scientific research and the process of not only identifying and developing medical techniques and procedures, but also the generalized care of patients. Before we move into Chapter 9, I have a few comments about Chapter 8 and the conclusion there too. 5 paragraphs before the conclusion of that chapter, you have a scene in which Montgomery and Prendrick are discussing alcohol and Prendrick's functionally being abstinent. I said no more. There was an outcry worse than the former. He looked at me, this is Montgomery looking at Prendrick, with his dull gray eyes, and then took some more whiskey. He tried to draw me into a discussion about alcohol, professing to have saved my life with it. He seemed anxious to lay stress on the fact that I owed my life to him. I answered him distractedly. So what we have here is a moment at which the very thing that renders away the humanity and the reason of Montgomery, his overindulgence in alcohol, is now something that he professes, that he says is the very thing that saved Prendrick's life. He's trying to take Prendrick and strip away that veneer of civility and responsibility, that refusal to indulge in his base instincts that makes Montgomery feel as if Prendrick is superior to him, or as if Prendrick is being self-absorbed and smugly superior in his abstinence from alcohol. In that first class, we looked at the way in which alcohol is a representation of the animalistic impulses that drive characters like Montgomery. After all, it robs people of their reason, and it provokes animalistic, rash, and violent behaviors on the part of Montgomery that likely led to him being banished from civilized society. Here, that sense of inferiority leads him to try to impose himself on Prendrick. Remember that I saved your life, and not only that, you were saved by alcohol. At the end of this chapter, there is an observation on the part of Prendrick that reflects on the nature of caring and our capacity as human beings for empathy. He hears the cries of the puma, and although he was familiar with the vivisectionist's techniques, he says, "The crying sounded even louder out of the doors. It was as if all the pain in the world had found a voice. Yet had I known such pain was in the next room, and had it been dumb, had it been silent, I believe I could have stood it well enough. It is when suffering finds a voice and sets our nerves quivering that this pity comes troubling us." In other words, we have a fantastical capacity as human beings to ignore or to relegate suffering to the darkness of ignorance, if only we are not aware of it consciously, or if only we are not able to sense it in some way, to feel it, to hear it, and to see it. If we can cast pain, if we can relegate pain and suffering to the peripheries of civilization and society, or to cast it outside of society so that we don't see it or we don't hear it, then suddenly it doesn't affect us emotionally, it doesn't inspire us to action. So when pain takes place behind closed doors, when voices are silenced, suddenly we have no trouble in becoming self-obsessed. And that, Wells seems potentially to be saying, is one of the great flaws of our nature, that we are so easily able to compartmentalize elements of our life and aspects of the world that we don't wish to grapple with. Here, in this summary of Chapter 9, I'm going to highlight key plot details and then unpack certain quotations from this chapter and concepts from this chapter in order to develop themes. Initially, Prendrick wanders off into the forest because he can no longer countenance the screams of the puma that elicit such sympathy and emotional pain from him. At this moment, we have, in part, Wells' commentary on the natures of animality and humanity here. The context for his entry into the forest, this savage, untamed wilderness populated by creatures or people that don't seem to be fully human, or at least are in that liminal space between animal and man for whatever reason Prendrick has not yet determined, is that Prendrick is moved to the very human capacity or very human expression of sympathy for a creature that might be brutish and bestial. It might not have any kind of rational sentiment, but he still feels this tugging of emotional sympathy, empathy, and feeling for it. And because of that humanity, or that expression of a human sentiment of sympathy that animals cannot experience, he is driven from the realm of scientific rationalism, the realm of constructed civilization of men in Montgomery's compound, into the untamed and bestial island, filled with unnamed horrors and the savagery that he will encounter there. Strangely, then, on a symbolic level, in terms of how the setting is operating in this moment, it is our human sentiments, our human capacities for pity and emotionalism that might in fact drive us from civilization into savage animality. So, in a way, it's almost as if our humanity itself is driving our animality, or those things that we associate with our humanity, our capacity for empathy, that are in fact animalistic in nature. By the end of this chapter, Prendrick concludes by saying, "Presently, with a positive effect of relief, came the pitiful moaning of the puma, the sound that had originally driven me out to explore this mysterious island. Suddenly, those tortured cries that elicited sympathy in him are a source of comfort. They welcome him back into the community of men inside Moreau's compound. During that journey out into the wilderness, Prendick sees a man drinking from a stream like an animal, and the man flees from him. At first, Prendick says, I could not distinguish what it was. It bowed its round head to the water and began to drink. Then I saw it was a man going on all fours like a beast. He was clothed in bluish cloth and was of a coppery-colored hue with black hair. It seemed that grotesque ugliness was an invariable character of these islanders. I could hear the suck of the water at his lips as he drank." As we learn later on in this section of text you have to read for today, or for this week's classes, this person, or this beast person, is doing precisely what is forbidden by the law. He is sucking up his drink. In response to being observed doing so, this creature feels a tremendous explosion of shame. He looked up guiltily, and his eyes met mine. Forthwith he scrambled to his feet and stood wiping his clumsy hand across his mouth and regarding me. The violation of the law, his confinement to these mind-forged manacles of the law, provokes in him a tremendous amount of shame and guilt as he looks upon somebody who has seen him behaving in this bestial fashion. This regression of the beast people to their animalistic impulses, the inexorable spiral towards animality of these creatures that have been fashioned into human shape by Dr. Moreau's hands, is a major motif of this section of the text. This man who is so ashamed of his bestial impulses that he has to conceal them, and possibly even tries to murder Prendick to prevent him from sharing his having seen this blasphemous action, is indicative of our human tendencies to try to suppress our animalistic impulses and to feel shame over them. But we see it come to the forefront time and time again. Roughly 1/3 of the way through the chapter, Prendrick comes across a rabbit that has been killed. But look at the way in which it has been described. The corpse is described. The dead body of a rabbit, covered with shining flies, but still warm and with the head torn off. I stopped aghast at the sight of the scattered blood. Here, at last, was one visitor of the island disposed of. There was no traces of other violence about it. It looked as if it had been suddenly snatched up and killed, and as I stared at the little furry body, it came the difficulty of how the thing had been done. So, the animal has been rent apart, it's had its head torn clean off. But the corpse, the main meat of the body itself, has been left untouched. There are no other signs of violence. What that tells us in the clear description of the corpse is that this kill was not done for the purposes of feasting on the body. It wasn't done out of necessity. It was done out of pure bloodlust. So these creatures hunt for sport. Human beings, or the worst elements of human nature, in our capacity to hunt for no purpose other than the satisfaction thereof, than some kind of elevation of our sense of pride, is also reflected here. That the beast people who have killed this creature, who have killed this rabbit, did so not because they were hungry, not necessarily because they wanted to consume it, but just to satisfy that base impulse because it has been suppressed over and over again. The repression of those desires have sprung forth in this brutally pointless or futile expression of violence. Here again, we have the conjunction of speech and humanity. As the beast people begin to rend themselves from their clothing, they begin to speak in gibberish. So at the bottom of page 27 in this version, roughly halfway through the chapter, as Prendrick comes upon the three beast people, they were talking, or at least one of the men was talking to the other two, and all three had been too closely interested to heed the rustling of my approach. They swayed their heads and shoulders from side to side. The speaker's words came thick and sloppy, and though I could hear them distinctly, I could not distinguish what he said. He seemed to me to be reciting some complicated gibberish. Presently his articulation became shriller, and spreading his hands he rose to his feet, and that the others began to gibber in unison, also rising to their feet, spreading their hands and swaying their bodies in a rhythmic chant. So what we have here is their inability to articulate themselves clearly. They descend into bestial grunting and howling, and the very process of reciting the law in their rote chant, their liturgy, or their mysterious rite, suddenly perverts or corrupts their language and makes it seem less than human, and thus them less than human in turn. It is this strange similarity or this blasphemous parody of humanity that makes them all the more horrifying, and renders them a disturbing commentary on the nature of our humanity as they lose control of their speech. They give over their speech, they give over their reason to a rote liturgical chant that is imposed on them. They're not using their speech to articulate their own thoughts. They're rethinking and representing the thoughts of others, and so lose some of their humanity. Suddenly, Prendrick says, as I watched their grotesque and unaccountable gestures, I perceived clearly for the first time what it was that had offended me, what had given me the two inconsistent and conflicting impressions of utter strangeness, and yet of the strangest familiarity. The three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite were human in shape, and yet human beings with the strangest air about them of some familiar animal. That familiar animal may in fact be man. In their parodic mimicry of human worship, of the law, of religious sentiment, suddenly they seem all the more horrifically strange because they put into stark relief the nature of our own structures of society, religion, belief, and life. Prendrick then encounters the beast person that he saw originally, that fled from him, and engages in a tense pursuit as he flees from the creature that is stalking him in the darkness. Eventually, he strikes the creature with a rock that he has picked up on the beach, and then flees to Moreau's compound, while the being or person lies stunned on the beach. In the next videos, we'll continue our summary of these chapters and reflect further on the development of themes in this portion of the text.